We all know the work we do is important. We all work hard in communities. We all have deep relationships in communities, and we know in effect that the work itself is important. I'm increasingly convinced that quality makes a huge difference in the work, and that striving to do the work you do at a high level of quality is important. And I'm not talking about some unrealistic notion of perfection or anything like that, because we all know that can waste a lot of time and resources, but just making sure that we're building quality in a way that makes the work unimpeachable, that people can't attack what you're doing because you've been a bit sloppy about data or sloppy about process or sloppy or willfully ignoring some facts that you should be paying attention to. So quality is tremendously important. And it's something I raise because it's not always easy to see that in your day-to-day work, to focus on that in your day-to-day work. Very often you get so close to the coal face that you can't see that vein of coal that you should be working towards. And so it's useful to think about strategies that enable you to at least periodically focus on quality issues. One of the things that at Maytree that we have always done, that has been there since the start, and at Caledon as well, and Paul and I have talked about this in terms of Tamarack. One of the things that we always want to do is be solutions oriented. And there is something that I call the culture of complaint that is prevalent in a lot of organizations and a lot of community groups. And that is where you spend an enormous amount of time describing a problem and assigning blame. And you spend 80–85% of your time doing that, and then your kind of message is somebody ought to do something about this. And we all know that effective organizations don't stop with the culture of complaint, that they're solutions oriented and they go about building practicable solutions. So avoiding that culture of complaint, I think, is an important thing. And one of the ways I think you can do it is by adopting some kind of analytical framework for the work you do. And just as a way of checking in and making sure that you're focusing on carrying it forward effectively. And I'm going to talk about one that I've been thinking about for a while and that we've begun to use in a number of organizations. And it's what I'm calling the 4 I's of policy and community work. And those 4 I's are intentionality, instruments, investment, and implementation. And intentionality means that we have to have a very public and out front intent to do something. And that might be something like, in Maytree's case, like attracting and integrating skilled immigrants into society. Or it might be in another organization to create environmental sustainability. But intentionality means that you don't just say the words, that you actually do them. And you mean them. Instruments means that we have to design the ways to achieve that intention. Or better still, adapt existing ways to do it. So when Caledon, for example, developed the National Child Tax Benefit, 15 years ago now, the instrument that they used to achieve that was the federal tax system. And that was an instrument that was in place that could be tapped into, but it was an effective way to deliver it. Similarly, Al at Massey was here yesterday.
He'll be here tomorrow.
He'll be here tomorrow, and he'll talk to you, I think, about the Registered Disability Savings Plan, a brilliant piece of work that Al and his organization spearheaded, and Caledon had a role in helping with that as well, but again, utilized the tax system to be able to do it. And the instruments that we develop, importantly, I think, have to be ready and easy, and they're not hugely complicated or really costly. And so focusing on the instruments to achieve your intention, I think, is incredibly important. Investments, of course, means that we have to put money behind these things, but it also means that we have to put people, the right people, the people who can effectively achieve these things behind them. and that we have to invest the political capital. And whether it's us in this room, or whether it's the people we're trying to influence in governments, or the people that we're trying to influence in corporations, the political capital has to be behind these instruments. Otherwise, they'll wither and just kind of dangle in the wind. And implementation, we all know that governments in particular have a lot of problem with implementation of programs, and those are part of the reports we hear periodically from auditors general about wasteful implementation processes. And it means a continuing effort to make sure that those instruments are functioning, and importantly that they're adjusted along the way to meet changing conditions, and that they're producing the intended outcomes. So I think that the 4 I's, you can develop your own framework, but to have a framework I think is really important, that you can go back every time you're kind of starting to feel you're not quite sure exactly where you are on a piece of work that you're doing, or an initiative of your organization, to have an analytical framework that you can go back and say, check against each one, in this case the 4 I's, I think is an important piece. It's really important to understand the political context that you're working in. And that very often means the governmental context, because of the way this country works, and the importance of government in many of the solutions that we're seeking. But it also means corporations or other bodies, institutions that are influential. And so in that sense, it's a small p political context. One of the biggest foundering points we've always found in our work is that when we leave all the heavy lifting for somebody else to do in an effort. There's a number of people here I know from Alberta, and Alberta had a wonderful provincial treasurer, and I wish he had become your premier, Jim Dinning. And I've known Jim for a number of years, and Jim has this stellar piece of advice. I think it's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard for people. When Jim was treasurer, he would say to people who came to him to try and persuade him to do something, he said, this is advice I always gave to my kids, and he says, I'll give it to you. Bring me something I can say yes to. And it's amazing how many people don't bring people like Jim something that he could say yes to. And that means that in the context of my 4 I's framework, that you have to do most of the work on those I's, that you have to create the instrument, or at least create the design, the basic design of an instrument. You have to worry about, figure out the money. You don't have to provide the money, but figure out where the avenues, for instance, with a child tax benefit, the tax system is the vehicle. That's where the funding for it is going to come from. And you've got to do most of that. And Jim said, if you bring me most of the stuff figured out, something I can say yes to, then I can work on things like intentionality of the government. I can begin to construct the necessary alignments that need to be in place between the various political interests, the public service interests, the timing of budgetary cycles, all those things that you have to take into account if you want to be effective. He says, bring me enough that I can work with. I can begin to sort that stuff out, because that's my job and I'm good at that. But if you just say, there's a big problem, you got to solve it, that's not going to get very far. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind in the work we do. And I know that in the Vibrant Communities projects, there was very much a sense of trying to make sure that there were practical things that when you went to a transit system or a housing corporation or whatever, there was something they could do something with. And I think that's important. On instruments, I've talked a little bit about the tax system and the child tax benefit and the RDSP. There are other things over the years that have been very effective with community groups or NGOs bringing forward ideas for change, for large-scale change. that have been effective because they've focused on doable things. They've identified the instruments. So there was a move, a number, I think, Paul, of the Vibrant Communities projects were dealing with access to public transit for low-income people. Those of us who have been advocates on the behalf of cities over the years, and I've been very active in that movement, have no transit as one of the huge issues. And we've been working with governments to try and get, and we've had some success getting the deductibility of transit passes as business expenses for corporations that provide transit passes to employees. And that works because you can identify that particular instrument. So as we go through looking at the various successful things like the acid rain legislation and successes of that nature over the years, many of these have come about because of a success in identifying or designing the instrument. So I would pay a lot of attention to that. The other thing I think it's incredibly important to pay attention to is whether you're asking the right people to make the changes you want. Canada's particularly confusing this way because of I hate to get, I know after you've had lunch there's a tendency to nod off a bit, and I'm going to accelerate that by talking about the Canadian Constitution and constitutional arrangements. So those of you who don't want to hear it, it'll be about 35 seconds, and just have a quick nap while I'm talking about it. But in Canada we have power divided principally between the federal government and the provincial governments. And municipal governments really don't have much of a place in the government hierarchy in Canada. And that's reflected in the fact that they only get about 8% of tax revenues. The other two levels of government split 92% of tax revenues. And that's because municipalities are really only have property tax that they can get revenues from. And so if you look at a large-scale problem like or a large-scale need like transit, and virtually every community, and certainly cities over 500,000 in Canada, cities over 250,000 in Canada, need more transit. We've got a huge transit gap and lag in this country. Or housing, low-income housing or supportive housing for people with disabilities. Huge gap in Canada in that, a real lag in our ability to provide that. These are big ticket items. These are billion-dollar items. And so where the need is most visible and most felt is in our cities and towns. And you see homeless people on the streets and you say, you know, we should do something about that. That's not the way we want to be as Canadians, and having people live that way. And so you go to your city government and you say, we have to do something about that, and they lack the fiscal capacity to do anything about that.